Welcome back to Module 10. Why are these people laughing? Now, it would be easier if I were in the classroom with you and could show you some of the YouTube video clips of these performers, but for now I'll just have to describe them. Tom Lehrer was in the 1950s and early 60s, a Harvard math professor. He's still alive, as far as I know, out in California. He doesn't perform much anymore. I heard an interview with him on NPR not long ago that said he just didn't feel funny anymore. And a brilliant satirical mind. I played a couple of songs of his for you on the first day of class, and I will play some more for you before the season is over. Will Rogers, I talked about him a little bit in part one. What a remarkable guy. He was on the radio, in movies, on stage, a very big and powerful personality. Mark Russell was a favorite satirist of mine. He used to perform in Washington. Every time I was there in the 70s and early 80s, I would go and see him at the Shoreham Hotel. These men intentionally did satire. Now, you know quite a bit about satire from Jon Stewart and John Oliver and, all of those programs. It's a form of comedy which requires you to know quite a bit about the subject to really appreciate the bite that the comedian is taking out of the particular public persona. It's sometimes broad, often it's very sharp and wickedly pointed, and that helps us see things. We'll talk about satire the next time when we talk about Norman Lear and All in the Family. These were some of the edgy ones. Lenny Bruce, Richard Pryor, George Carlin, Dick Gregory. They were ahead of whatever the conventional social, cultural curve was at the time. Mort Sahl, early in his career, performed in New York City and just had that edgy quality that appealed to the Greenwich Village crowd, but sort of made him a niche comedian until the world caught up with him. George Carlin was famously edgy. Lenny Bruce got arrested on stage for some of the things he said, and those are words that you hear every day, every couple of minutes on cable now. Dick Gregory was first a comedian and then later an activist, and he actually was on campus at St. Benedict's College when it was a men's school back in 1968. I saw him perform. Richard Pryor, you've probably seen his work in films. Unhappily, he too is dead by now. A wonderful talent, but really, really on the edgy end. Now, there were many funny women during the 20th century as well. Gracie Allen, most among them. I have her in the upper right-hand corner here. She was George Burns' real-life wife and real-life partner. Very funny. Across the bottom of the left, we've got Mary Tyler Moore, who had a long-running television series. Martha Ray, who was funny in movies. Carol Burnett, long a feature on television. Margaret Dumont, the stodgy foil of the Marx Brothers. Fanny Brice, who was a Ziegfeld star. And then Gilda Radner. I will show you a little Gilda Radner. She was, as it turns out, married to Gene Wilder. Later in life, died of cancer. A very gifted performer. Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball, as I mentioned before in the section on women, was a brilliant businesswoman as well as a great performer. Phyllis Diller here was a woman who took her role as housewife and mother of five and then exploded into a career as stand-up. Very irreverent, very self-deprecating, a really, really funny woman. No group was funnier than the real-life brothers, the Marx Brothers. Now, there was also a fourth, Zeppo, who performed in about 6 of their movies, but did not go on with them. They were great talents and great teams, and they took a lot of the material that they used in vaudeville and used on stage shows and brought it to television, brought it to film. So you watch their films in the 30s. One of my favorite is Duck Soup. And We'll take a look at that when we're in the classroom. I also suggest that you should go to YouTube and just type in stateroom scene. They have a very famous scene in one of their films where they get too many people in too small a stateroom on a cruise ship. The Smothers Brothers, Burns and Allen, Martin Lewis, back again to Abbott and Costello. The partnerships in comedy could be very, very satisfying. One being a straight man, the other being the comic. The chemistry was so much fun to watch. And these characters each had a persona. For example, Dean Martin was the tall, good-looking Italian singer, and Jerry Lewis was the short, kind of nerdy Jewish kid who always made strange voices. But each of them, and together, were grand performers. The Smothers Brothers, real-life brothers, one of them plays the more naive part. I think it's Dickie, the shorter one, that plays the naive part. They take these roles and they build their comedy out of them, and they have some great material. I want you to look at the link I give you here to hear them sing about My Old Man. Now, Matt Groening, a richly talented guy who gave the world The Simpsons as well as other cartoons. This guy is full of social commentary. If you want to understand what was going on in the 20th century, you need to watch The Simpsons. And again, it was sort of anti-intellectual because you take Homer and he's always going, "Doh!" And he wants donuts and he wants his beer. And it's Matt Groening with his satirical take on this. Now, Gary Larson was another cartoonist who dealt with single panel stories in The Far Side. In the beginning of July of this summer, Gary Larson has just returned after a 25-year hiatus. This is a wonderful cartoon, The Midvale School for the Gifted. It's pretty funny. This cartoon at the bottom, where the heavenly messenger says to the clown arriving in heaven, "Well, that was a birthday party the kids won't soon forget." You know, Barsotti was good. Barsotti started off in Kansas City. He actually worked for the New Yorker for a long time. I met him years ago when he ran for Congress in Kansas. Seinfeld, observational humor, a show about nothing, the characters, the Kramer and Elaine and George and Jerry. I mean, these are people who create not just comedy, but create cultural icons, create cultural moments. No soup for you. I mean, all of these expressions that come from Seinfeld. And of course, you get a chance to enjoy them in syndication. Speaking of syndication, Three's Company and Friends are two very popular 20th century shows that dealt with relationships. There was an appeal because this is what the time was. The 70s and 80s, people were looking to explore with a little bit more adventure into their relationships, social relationships, and these series took the comical twist on those. Now, back in the 50s and 60s, it started off with Sid Caesar and Imogen Coca in your show of shows, and then the Sid Caesar show. There's a great story I read in Sid Caesar's biography about a year ago where he was advertised, his sponsor was Admiral Television. And after the first year, it was a tremendous success. He went on summer hiatus and he got news that Admiral Television canceled his program, canceled their sponsorship. And he met with the guy in Chicago who was the president of the company. And the president said to Sid, he said, "Sid, I'm awfully sorry. You know, we're spending a lot of money on advertising with your program. And we, at that time, got started, we're making 5,000 televisions a week. And after your show, we couldn't meet the demand. We were selling 50,000 televisions if we can make them. So I had to stop my sponsorship to put my money into production. Sid Caesar said to him, that's the first time that a sponsor has ever canceled a show or ever stopped his sponsorship for his success. Milton Berle, one of the crazy of all time. Down in the lower left-hand corner, Ruth Buzzy, who was on Laugh-In, a very groundbreaking show, again, back in 1968, and for several years it followed. It was political, it was pointed, it was edgy. You go watch a couple of those on YouTube as well. But all of them depended on classical material and their inventive interpretation of it. That's what made them funny. Now, again, you don't think much about radio in the early days of television. These are some performers who had great success on radio. From the lower right, we get Jack Benny and his nemesis, Fred Allen, and then Charlie McCarthy, and his keeper, Edgar Bergen, Jimmy Durante playing the piano, Fibber McGee and Molly, Molly Goldberg. These programs were on radio, and people were diverted to their radio programs. They would sit down in the evening, listen to those programs, whether it was comedy, whether it was drama. These, of course, are all comedy. And some were variety shows, and some were sort of serials of family, like Fibber McGee and Molly. Marshall McLuhan was a very famous Canadian academic, actually, and he came up with this idea about hot medium and cold medium. And what he said is, he said, television is a cold medium. Television does not involve you. Television gives you the sound, it gives you the images, it doesn't require any imagination. However, radio is a hot medium. You sit and you listen to the radio, and you have to fill in the pictures in your mind. I remember when I was a kid listening to baseball games, I would listen to Harry Carey on the radio, and he'd describe the action, the play-by-play action. And having been to Busch Stadium many times, I could see it in my mind. I could imagine it, whether it was a hot day in St. Louis or whether it was a rain delay. The same thing with radio drama and comedy circumstances. These guys, Bob and Ray, look them up on YouTube, see if you can find some of their old routines. They were really, really funny, and I think their humor lasted past the 20th century. These guys were just, their shtick was just nuts. I mean, Spike Jones and his City Slickers was a really odd group back in the late 30s, early 40s, and into the 50s. And they played all these strange instruments, and he'd shoot a starter pistol in the sky, and they just were zany. And all three of these guys were zany. You've probably seen Carrot Top, the orange-headed comedian featured here in the curly hair. And then Gallagher. Why is Gallagher funny taking his big mallet and smashing a watermelon on stage? I don't know, but he is. And he's funny otherwise. But he is representative with the others of the zanies. Now, African Americans have been prominent comedians. They've been funny people. However, during the 20th century, a lot of the style and content was inappropriate, yet it was mainstream humor. In the upper left-hand corner, you see Eddie Rochester Anderson. He became a longtime sidekick after doing a one-show gig on Jack Benny's radio show. And he played the role of Mr. Benny's driver, drove his old Maxwell automobile. And he had a chance to have a lot of funny lines. And he was a funny guy. Down in the lower left, you see the Jeffersons. They were a series that spun off of All in the Family. We'll talk about that. Here in the center, you can see Chevy Chase and Garrett Morris. Garrett Morris was one of the original members of the Saturday Night Live cast. And then we have Willie Best. Willie Best was a character who played sort of the stereotypical African American in the view of a lot of writers. One of the interesting parts, it's not funny, but one of the interesting parts about blacks in movies, in 1962, Frank Sinatra produced and starred in a movie called The Manchurian Candidate, a very difficult and dark brainwashing film that ends in a political assassination. The psychiatrist in that movie was a young black actor, and 1962 was the first time that a black actor was cast in a role in The Manchurian Candidate not written for a black actor. Prior to that, and even after that, a lot of these roles were young black man, older black woman, attractive young black woman. But that was an interesting one. Amos and Andy, we'll talk a lot about this over the next couple of days as we talk about race in comedy. It was a program that was on television only for a few years, but on radio for many years. This I will spend some time with you in the classroom talking about All in the Family. This program was actually adapted by Norman Lear from a British program and brought to the United States. Archie was a white bigot from the Bronx, and he didn't like black people, he didn't like Chinese people, he didn't like any kind of people that weren't like him. But the great thing about Norman Lear is he went out on the ledge and satirized Archie Bunker's bigotry. And the more he satirized him and the more Archie dug in to his bigotry, the stupider he looked. And this program was quite a gamble for the network when it finally accepted it by Norman Lear. And it turns out for 5 years in a row, this was the top program in the Nielsen ratings. More people tuned into this program every single week for 5 years than any other program on television. So it was the early 70s, and America was reacting and was changing and was becoming more socially aware. And Archie Bunker had something to do with it. When I show you this clip in class, you'll see Archie's beat up old chair. His chair is actually now on display at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington as part of cultural iconography. Archie Bunker and his lovely family. Children's comedies. They appeal to adults as well. I grew up with Buffalo Bob and Howdy Doody. This was one of the programs we'd watch after school every single day. And here's the 10th anniversary, and there's Clarabelle the Clown. I also remember the Buster Brown Show. That was a pretty good show. I don't remember Andy's Gang, although I do remember Andy Devine. We, the baby boomers, got hooked on television early, and we got hooked with these kind of comedy children's shows, magic shows, and on Saturday, westerns. Now, I can't leave the 20th century without talking a little bit about Red Skelton. Red Skelton was a very sensitive and gifted comic and comedian. He could say things funny, and he could also say funny things. And you see from this slide, he created all these characters that he returned to. He had quite a history in MGM movies too, making comedies there. I remember in 1958, his son Richie died, and he was on once a week, and I remember watching the show, and I was 11 years old, and his son Richie was 11, and Richie died of leukemia. And of course, I never thought of children my age dying, and Red Skelton talked about him so tenderly and talked about him with such great love, and it was part of the character of the comic. It wasn't funny, it was truthful, and that's what Red Skelton brought. His truth as well as his zany, absurd, and ironic comedy. Red Skelton, one of the greats of the 20th century. And that is why people were laughing in the 20th century.